It was because of a mismatch with the therapist's time and whatnot. But the majority of people said that they stopped going to treatment because they saw an abatement or relief of their symptoms, whether it be depression, anxiety, or trauma that they were going through. Because for a lot of people, the biggest issue that they face is they've never had someone who sat there and said, you can tell me anything you want, and I will not be there to judge you. You can say what you want, and it'll be confidential. It's between you and I. Of course, in all states, there's a limitation to that, abuse of vulnerable adults, abuse of children, and there's those legal limitations, but it's really the first time someone has been allowed just to what I call emotionally vomit and just get everything out. And we find with a significant number of people who don't continue with treatment of counseling and therapy, it's because they get a relief of their symptoms just from having that opportunity finally with someone just to say everything on their mind without concerns of judgment. Okay. When we get into the Middle Ages, we start to see mental illness be a spiritual matter. And so what we're going to see through the Middle Ages, this is near the end of the Roman Empire in the 1st century, 2nd century, and up to the 17th century, when we're getting into what's called the Enlightenment years. Really issues of mental illness and issues we work with here with social work were given to the guys of the church. It was the church who said, this is what's going on. And instead of mental illness being called mental illness, it was called madness. And it was assumed that the person was in the league of the devil or possession by spirits. And as we see going into the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, we start to see the idea of witchcraft. We start to see issues of mainly mentally ill, especially women who are then tortured or exiled or hung or burned at the stake because they were suffering from a mental illness, but because of the religious overtone, it was seen that they were possessed by the devil or they were in league with the devil. This has really kept with us even into our modern centuries. We see well into our 20th century and now into our 21st century, where there's an association between mental illness and criminal behavior, that criminal behavior and mental illness are almost seen one and the same. If you look at a lot of, especially low income mental health hospitals, rehab facilities, they are very prison-like. If we look at things like orphanages or places where children are sent before being placed into a foster care system, they are very much set up like a juvenile hall, and they're very much treated like they themselves are criminals. And so these years, these almost 17 centuries, especially in the Western world, of demonizing and criminalizing mental health really has led to this notion that if you're mentally ill, you must be criminal. And if you're criminal, you must be mentally ill. And we will see this next week, especially when we get into social reform, well into the 18th and 19th century, when individuals start visiting insane asylums. We'll see people in chains. We will see people in basically prison bars because they are suffering from a mental illness, not that they've committed any crime, but because they're suffering from a mental illness. And we'll start to see some of these reforms that have tried to happen over the years, but this still lays with us even today. I think of, for example, school shootings. School shooting happens, and the thing you'll hear on the news from politicians and from everyone is it's mental health. We've got to invest in mental health, mental health, mental health, mental health. Yet there is very little evidence that school shootings occur from someone who is suffering from a mental illness or a mental deficiency. If we look at the lives of most people who commit school shootings, if we look at their history, we don't see a history of mental illness. What we see is a history of rejection and denying who they are. We see social rejection being the main cause of school shootings, not that the individual is mentally ill. And so even today, when we look at the issues of school shootings and those kinds of things, we see this notion, oh, we must invest in mental health, when in really what we should be doing is investing in public health and learning to treat each other more decently as we move forward. And it should be a social treatment, not an individual treatment. But we'll get to that later in the semester when we talk about those different types of dynamics. So, but from the Middle Ages through the 17th century, we see this notion that if you're mentally ill, you must be in league with the devil. When we get into the 18th century and we get into what's called the moderate enlightenment, we start getting away from religious explanations for mental illness. We see the idea that mentally disordered people have degenerations, meaning that they're decompensating in some way. And treatment tends to be because they fear that they're not safe for the world. We see a lot of isolation of the mentally ill. This is where we see that mental illness facilities are more prison-like than they are curative or treatment-wise. And sometimes we even see the increase of bloodletting into these years. Again, we need to keep in mind that it wasn't until the 1950s where we start to see drugs being used for treatment of mental illness. So before then, the way you get someone who is hysterical to calm down is either you chain them up or you drain enough blood out of them that they no longer can function in their hysterical or psychopathological way. So we see that that kind of trend occurring during this time. Into the 19th century, and we'll really talk a lot about this in the weeks to come, as we start to see the attempts of reform. And so we're going to start with some individuals. Phillip Canal, he's really the one who started reform in Paris in mental hospitals by saying, no, these people need cared for. They need to be treated in a moral way. That the way for someone to recover is to treat them with moral dignity. And so you see in Paris with Phillip Canal, the remove of restraints in mental hospital. You start to see mentally ill being more humanely treated. And some patients got better enough to even leave the hospital at this time. And we also start to see the development of individualized therapies based on diagnosis and life history. We see the first diagnostic manuals for mental illness start to develop in the late 1700s and into the 1800s, where a person is individualized instead of seen as just being mentally deficit. Now, I'm going to say this because we still have to remember it's part of the time and part of the place, is a lot of these individualized diagnoses usually had to deal with the female, especially here in the United States and especially in the European countries. Men tended not to be diagnosed very often with a mental illness. It usually was the woman. and the main diagnosis was hysteria. And hysteria, if you want to think about this, you think about hysterectomy, which is the removal of the female sexual organs. Well, hysteria has that same implications. Hysteria is believed to be the wandering womb, that the womb somehow disconnected from the female, and it was creating havoc within the female body. And that's what made the women at the time go quote unquote crazy or hysterical or off the wall. But at this time, it was up to the man, whether it be the father or the husband, to decide whether or not the female needed treatment or not. And so it was really dictated by the partner and not the actual patient about where the treatment was going. And of course, once you say it's because it's a female problem and the male partner then has no culpability in the situation, you can see why even in these early diagnostic years, it was seen, mental illness was largely seen as a female problem. And so we're going to address that because we're going to talk about reforms here in the United States, because we're going to see a couple trends, and these are important trends here in the United States that we need to understand. First trend starts with children here in the United States. Animals, domesticated animals, were given basic human rights before children were. In fact, it was the main organization that sought child welfare laws here in the United States was the National Humane Society for Animal Treatment. Some individuals teamed with them, and it was actually the animal rights people who lobbied the country and the government for children's rights. And so we need to talk about that in the weeks to come, about how even though in the United States we say children are important, we say children are our future, our behaviors and the way we've traditionally treated children, and especially the colonized United States, the Western United States, is a totally different story. And we can see that even today with our unwillingness to invest in education, our unwillingness to invest in our child's life, even though everyone confesses that children are the most important thing, we're just not willing to invest in them. And we'll talk more about that and how that comes from these historical roots of the way we've seen children and we've seen what their purpose was, but we'll get to that later on as well. We also see the treatment of women took a very long time here in the United States to take hold. We see children's welfare a little bit before women's rights. And then we even need to reduce it down even further, because most of those rights that were originally given to women in the 1910s and the 1920s, such as voting rights and stuff, were limited to white Caucasian women. We're not going to see rights for example, Native American women, African American women, and even Mexican American women until we get into the 1950s and the 1960s. When they're going to be granted the same rights as their suffrage white counterpart. So we see that this trend, these trends about how we treated people in the past, and even though we see it negatively and we see, how could you bloodlet? How could you restrain people? How could you not give? We see these trends still even today. They're just kind of hidden a little bit better behind morality and all of those different things and people's opinion about what creates social wrongs. But in the 19th century, so we're talking 1800s, we did see some reforms in the US system. We see a more moral treatment movement, advocating for more human care. A lot of times, which this led to large state-supported public asylums instead of local asylums that were more like jails or prison. So we're going to see the mental hospital system, the asylum system, really start to pick up in the 19th century. But problems persisted, such as overcrowding. There were no effective types of treatment. And eventually the interest waned in investing in large public programs to help the mentally ill. In fact, what we're going to see during the JFK years, John F. Kennedy years, is he's going to sign a De-Institutionalization proclamation, which is going to basically empty out all of our mental hospitals. And he's going to say this is a problem that communities need to take care of on the community level, but they're not ever going to put enough sufficient financial support in that. Hence, a lot of our homeless population are a product of that deinstitutionalization, and that's why we have a large homeless population that also is suffering from mental illness. Is it goes right back to the 1960s with the deinstitutionalization of mental health hospitals. Now, you could argue what would be better or worse for these individuals. I would say that investing actually in communities would be the solution that was promised by Kennedy, but was never delivered by him or any other president or federal or state government agency since. And I should mention, because we'll talk about her again next week, Dorothy Dix is the one who really took off with the U.S. reform. She famously went to some of the quote unquote local insane asylums and saw people chained up, saw people defecating on themselves, saw people being treated like they were criminals, even though they hadn't committed any criminal crimes. And this is really, Dorothy Dix is an important figure, especially for our field of social work. In the field of social work, here in the United States, it really starts with Dorothea Dix, and then her followers and the people after her are going to formalize the governmental system of social work and eventually the private field of social work. So she's an important figure, at least specifically within social work. So we'll take a closer look at her in the next couple of weeks. Okay. And then I did mention, I know in the first week, we have Sigmund Freud with his psychoanalysis in the 1890s. He's going to be the first to come up with that term, the talking cure, which is then going to turn into formalized psychotherapy. And then counseling is an off take of that. So these individuals are very important because they really start the reform process. We have Sigmund Freud with psychiatry and the psychologists and the individual psychotherapy. And we have Dorothy Dix, who is doing the social reform on the social systems arena. So these individuals were important in time and place. All right, does anybody have any questions? I'm hoping that this is a review from your intro to social work classes or an intro to, in combination with an intro to psych class. So I'm hoping that this is just a basic review, but does anybody have any questions at this moment?
None, I have none.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. Okay. All right. So let's talk about some major developments that happened in the 20th century. And again, I'm hoping that this is just a review of the different things that have happened. One of the things that is going to be huge, especially in our 20th century, is new biological therapies, which is going to start in the 1930s. And then it's going to lead to what's called better living through chemistry, which is the anti-psychotic drug introduced in the mid-1950s. We're going to see the development of antidepressant pills. We're going to see the development of anti-anxiety pills. And yes, there were actually advertisements in the 50s and 60s about living better through chemistry, because we felt at the time that drugs could fix just about anything. But we'll see how that not always so true, or a little bit fictitious. But in the 1930s, we start to see some interesting developments of different type of therapy, such as insulin coma therapy, where basically someone is put into an overwhelming level of insulin that they go into a comic state. I want to couple this with electroshock therapy, which is today it's still done, but it's basically, and I don't mean to speak non-technical, it's basically when you shock the hell out of somebody. And what we have learned from this is, yes, these are very effective at abating especially major depression symptoms and some psychotic symptoms. But what we have learned is both forms of this therapy, basically the reason they work is they basically create memory loss. They're effective because the person cannot remember why they're depressed. They can't remember why they were having the issues that they were having. They still had them. They just had no memory of why. Now, I will say today, some movements in electroshock therapy where we don't do this as much anymore. We do what's called more targeted cell therapy. And this is an example. When I was working at the University of Montana, in Montana, I was involved in research where for someone who was not able to get rid of their depression through drugs or through other kind of psychotherapies or counseling, there were two types of therapies that are similar to this one, but not as invasive and not as horrifying. One is they would drill a little hole in the top of the head and put a little electrode in the location of the neural circuits that are associated with depressive symptoms. So we know when somebody starts to get depressive symptoms, there's these certain neural tracks that start to light up. And so we would either put little electrodes into that area, or in some cases, we could use a little headband that then would do a targeted magnetic shock to that area, or a magnetic wave in that area, and both of these were meant to disrupt that neural circuit. And when I left that research, we did find that those type of therapies were pretty effective at abating major depressive symptoms. Then people, once they hit the little button to give themselves that little electrode shock or that little magnetic impulse, would almost immediately feel a relief in their depressive symptoms. And in fact, these therapies, the magnetic therapy has been approved by the FDA. And if I've actually seen advertisements for it on Facebook, where there's some organizations that will put the headband on, get it targeted for you so that you can try that. The other way, especially with psychosis, that became famous is frontal lobotomies, okay? And frontal lobotomies are basically when you take a kind of something that looks like a wire clothes hanger or a little thin metal thing, and what you would do is you would lift up the top of the eyelid, and you would insert the coat hanger basically above the eyeball and insert it into the occipital lobe. And then you would angle it, and then you would just basically squish the wire back and forth, which would make your frontal lobe just basically become gelatin. It was non-functioning at all. And this is called a frontal lobotomy. And it was very effective with people with severe schizophrenia, severe psychosis, and everything else, because they really basically became vegetables. They would still function because they still had a functional limbic system. They would still eat, drink, breathe, heart rate, feel some emotions. But other than that, they were just blank in the face. And it was seen as successful because, well, the symptoms of psychosis or schizophrenia would go away. But they just were never ever functional beyond that. And so we still do see some frontal lobotomies. It tends to be more targeted today. They don't use clothes hangers. They actually use surgery now. But that's kind of the start of that. So we see in the 1930s, mentally, the reason why I bring this up was we start to see mental illness seen as a physical disorder. And that's the importance of this movement. And then going into the 1950s, we see this continued idea that mental illness is something physical. It's has less to do with God. It has less to do with a moral deficiency. It has less to do with that. And it has to do with something physical going on today. And we do see this, again, the continuation of this today with most people, when they feel depressed, they go to the doctor, they get a prescription. Most people, when they're put in a mental institution, will instantly be put on drugs. We see, and these are all positive things. I'm not degrading these things. We see things like addiction, instead of being seen as a moral deficiency, we see it as a disease now. And so we do see from these little horrifying examples and things in the beginning, and even some of these with drug experiments, while they were kind of horrifying in the beginning, they became more and more refined, and allows us today to see mental illness and social wrongs as more of diseases rather than moral deficiencies in the individual. The other thing, and I've mentioned this before, we go from getting people out of asylums and back into the community. So we see JFK's de-institutionalization movement in the early 1960s. And we see the establishment, and I think this is important for social workers and for anyone interested in going into counseling and therapies to understand that this is where we start to see the development of community mental health centers that were there for the community and were there to serve the community. Now, with deinstitutionalization, the systems have become very overwhelmed because with the development of community centers, not only are you trying to serve the people who are already there, but now you're getting an insurgence of populations from these deinstitutionalized centers. And so, especially in the beginning and even into today, we see this idea of community mental health centers, which is good, but we see them as very well understaffed and underfunded. And so those are another issue that we'll talk about when we get into private funding for 501c3 private organizations. We see a lot of private organizations start to be developed. Probably one of my favorite nonprofit private organizations is actually UPS, the founder of UPS. Most of their philanthropy with UPS goes to foster children and foster services. And there has been, they mainly focused on children who are aging out of the foster system. And many of the system supports that are in place for individuals aging out of the foster system actually comes not from federal or governmental funding, but from grants from UPS. And so those guys in brown that deliver your package, give them a pat on the back, because even though it's not, we see too many children aging out of the foster system who have no options, at least they're one organization that is trying to make a difference through private funding. And so that's an example of how private organizations have started to try and get involved to pick up where governmental agencies have failed greatly in our nation. Okay. And so this is an example of modern electric compulsive therapy. Usually you have people recording it and blood pressure and everything else, and then basically the person is shocked. Today we use sedative muscle relaxants and stuff like that so bones don't get broken like they did in the past. We use heart monitors to make sure the heart doesn't basically go into cardiac arrest and those kind of things. And this modern electric compulsive therapy is only used when no other treatment modality has worked. But as I mentioned before, we are getting better with more targeted types of therapies, such as the electrodes that can be installed into the skull, or the magnetic band that seems to have more effectiveness. So this is being used less and less, and we're really focusing on more targeted types of treatment for this. We do, I did mention this, that there has been some somatic type of treatments. We talked about lobotomies, lobotomies, and we talked about insulin coma therapies. But there was also something called fever therapies. So in early days, they would actually inject patients with someone who had malaria, and really basically gave them malaria. And they noticed that sometimes with the fever they got, they would see a reduction in their symptomology. So we see different type of somatic type of treatments. And we see here, this is kind of a timeline here in the 1920s. We see biological therapies start to be developed in the 1930s. We see the de-institutionalization in the 1960s, anti-psychotic drugs, and really probably the important one for us in social work and in counseling, and what really has supported our current mechanisms of social work and counseling is in the 1961 with the development of community mental health centers. But we do have to remember back here in the 1920s, we see the formalization of the government-based social work programs. This is when we start getting into child welfare, child and other forms, and we see in the 1980s, we really see the development of the domestic violence movements, the sexual assault movements. And so there's a lot to talk about in between here that isn't recognized in this diagram. Okay. And we can see, you know, the effectiveness of this idea of anti-psychotic drugs and the use of it. Is if we look at the introduction of anti-psychotic drugs, you can see that we then followed by a rapid reduction in the populations within our mental hospitals. So this again just emphasizes our change in attitude about mental illness from being a moral deficit to a physical deficit. But I do want everybody to keep in mind that on a cultural level, we still see mental illness as more of a moral deficit than we do a physical deficit. When we see the advancements of psychotherapy or counseling, again, we see the introduction of the formal variation with the Sigmund Freud. And then when we get into the 1970s and into the 1980s, we start to see more formalized types of therapies. We see family therapy being developed in the 1970s. We see behavioral approaches in the 1950s. And kind of the point of this graph is to see the kind of the advancement of counseling as a formal discipline. And again, this is a Western version of this history. And we see, the development of what's called motivational interviewing, which we will actually look at when we get to case management. It's a different type of interviewing of clients, is that with motivational interviewing, what you're not looking for is deficits. You're looking for areas of growth, areas where the person can have successes in and build upon, instead of focusing necessarily on the individual's deficits and the problems they're having. We're looking for, with motivational interviewing, a process of change that already builds upon the capacity of the individual. And that's a big change from previous therapies, which focuses specifically only on deficits of the individual. And we will see even in today, I don't know if I've mentioned it in this class, but within my field dealing with identity, we've seen that great decreases in things such as depression symptoms and anxiety symptoms and those types of things, and even trauma symptoms, when instead of focusing on the negative social aspects of the person, you focus on their positive identity. We've seen some great results in creating a positive identity for especially fringe or minority groups. And instead of the therapist focusing on the negativities of life, you focus on the strength of that identity of the individual. And that's kind of a takeoff of motivational interviewing, but it's bringing in the person's identity as, let's say, a Native American or a Mexican American or the like, and really emphasizing those qualities of having that kind of identification with a person's social or cultural world. This has come out in about the last 12 years, that therapists who really focus on those identities, we're seeing some great results in the reduction of depression and trauma and anxiety symptoms. Okay. Trying to think of what this one is. All right. So I kind of want to stop there. That's a quick preview of kind of where we're heading in the next couple of weeks with our series of lectures. I want to know, does anybody have any questions about the timelines that we've talked about today? Because next week we'll get more specific into psychotherapies. The following week we'll get into systems theory, and dealing more with the social work area of helping fields. But I want to kind of put a halt right here and talk about, does anybody have any questions about these timelines and about kind of where some of the perceptions from our dominant culture about mental illness and everything has come from?
No questions for me.
All right, thank you, Christina. All right. Thank you, Claudia. And like I said, I'm hoping that a lot of today's lecture is review from your introduction to social work class and whatnot. So I'm hoping today was mostly just a review of the timelines and the historical development of different things, but I wanted to make sure we had that conversation. So if you don't mind, I'm going to stop the recording because this doesn't have much to do with lecture or anything like that. So I'm going to